Good morning, everybody. My name is Michael Kuelker. Thank you for being here. I am a professor of English at St. Charles Community College. I'm also the organizer for Democracy Days 2001 to present. And we are here today under the banner of poetry and democracy. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to speak with you. And I would like to remind you that there is a chat box underneath the video. I would invite your comments and your questions. And I'm going to throw out a few questions for you to be thinking of because I'd like to make this as participatory as possible. We're not in the conventional classroom this semester, and we're not in a Zoom room, but we are able to have some interactive dimensions to these presentations, and that's through the chat box. I'd like to throw out a few questions for you. I'd like to know, since we're dealing with poetry and democracy today, what are your favorite political poems? I'd like to hail those up when we have our discussion time. I'd like to know what types of American experience you would like to read about in poetry and haven't done so yet. And this isn't inherently about democracy, but I'd like to have you think about poetry and any place in the American landscape where you would like to read poetry or read poetry about, and be as specific as you can. If you like Walden Pond, for instance, or if you like the beach, don't just say a beach, think of what particular spot on the American landscape you'd like to read poetry about, because this is an hour where we will proselytize on behalf of poetry in America, and especially poetry of democracy. I'd like to remind you that there is a Democracy Days program booklet at the top of this webpage. I invite you to click that because we're just beginning day 3. We have 2 more presentations today, 2 panels, as a matter of fact, that will be absolutely outstanding. At 11:30, there's a panel on civic engagement, and at 1 p.m., a panel session on Black Lives Matter. I encourage you to attend those. And in addition, please take a look at the presentation handout that I've made available at the top of this web page as well. I'll be kind of going down the list of some topics, and there's certainly plenty of time for discussion. I wanted to use this hour to proselytize on behalf of poetry and to do it under the banner of democracy. On my handout, if you want to take a look at that, I've got some questions that can get us thinking. Because this title alone gives us the opportunity to ponder what is democracy in relation to poetry? What is the tradition of democracy and poetry in America? What, in the first place, makes a poem democratic? How do poets represent democracy differently? What kinds of experiences are represented in literature classes at the high school and college levels? And what do our high school and college students get assigned to read? Because that's part of this discussion too, not just poetry about democracy, which we'll get into shortly, but what is the nature of our curriculum? Is it as inclusive and democratic as it ought to be? These are some questions that I'd like us to ponder. And certainly with poetry and democracy, one way to address this is to take a look at poems that are about democracy itself. And I'd like to begin with Langston Hughes in a moment. And before we get into Mr. Hughes, I'd like to propose a question. Why is democracy a good context for a discussion of poetry? And I'd like to propose that one answer is that because laws protecting free speech and a culture of open discourse is good and necessary for art in general, not just poetry. And we need to remember that repressive societies will deny human rights and make it sometimes impossible for artists. Repressive societies imprison artists. And one of my introductions to that specter was with the late Russian poet Joseph Brodsky. Joseph Brodsky won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1987. He was also named the US Poet Laureate in 1991. I happened to hear him speak at Washington University in 1992. And Joseph Brodsky born in Leningrad in 1940, suffered repression under the Soviet Union, and in fact was imprisoned for being a poet and for expressing the kinds of things that poets do. And here's a look at Joseph Brodsky. I was intrigued by the fact that Brodsky proposed during his tenure of poet laureate. He proposed that inexpensive anthologies of the best American poets be made available in places where they're not normally available, such as in hospitals and supermarkets and hotels. His idea was that people who are lonely and distressed and suffering all forms of stress, they would discover these anthologies made available in the supermarket lines, et cetera, and they would discover that they're not alone, that so many of the emotions and situations that we find ourselves in are common experiences, and literature can break that isolation. So I was intrigued by the fact that this Russian-born poet, speaking English as a second or third language, got in tune so well with the American experience. And I remember him saying, poetry anthologies should be made as available and as cheaply as the National Enquirer in supermarkets. That was an interesting insight and understanding regarding the American condition. So that's one theme, that we can learn something fundamental about democracy by putting ourselves in touch with poets who are denied the norms of a free society. A second reason why democracy is a good context for discussion of poetry is that we get a good look at ourselves through this poetry. Poetry and democracy puts us in touch with works of literature that are crucial in understanding our nation. And I think that's where we should click the video for Langston Hughes. I've got two things on tap, one titled Democracy and one titled I Too. We're being aided today by Nick Wallace. Nick, if you don't mind, take it away on that video.
Democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fella has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I am dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom just as you.
All right. Thank you, Nick. That's Langston Hughes. And that particular track featured some jazz performers, and I chose that particular version for you today because, well, for a couple of reasons. One, Langston Hughes did make it a practice to read in front of musical accompaniment, and he wrote about music, as many of you know. And he found that jazz was a quintessentially American art form that was ideal for poetry. Jazz, of course, like blues music, being an early 20th century invention in America, jazz being democratic in nature, and that there's not a strict form for songs to be interpreted or expressed, but they have a lot of interpretive leeway. In many cases, everybody gets some solo time. It's very democratic as a musical form, and it's a good way to encounter poetry. That was Democracy. Did we also see I Too, or is that one next? Next, Nick, if you could play I Too by Langston Hughes.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
That's Langston Hughes with I Too. These are two very famous poems by the dean of the Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes from Joplin, Missouri, major voice in African-American literature and American letters overall in the 20th century. Notice what his theme is in both of those, and particularly with I Too, because of the imagery of the table. He sees democracy as having a place at the table, and that's a crucial concern in any kind of democratic context. I'm reminded, though, that Langston Hughes is not the only voice speaking for Black America. And it came to me again yesterday during a panel session when my colleague Rachel McWhorter mentioned a TED Talk video that's absolutely critical. If you haven't seen something titled The Danger of a Single Story, take a look at that. It's about 10 or 11 years old, still very important. And it's the idea that if we have a multicultural component to something, we can't have just one person or one text stand in to represent that whole. That's part of what that TED Talk has to do with. And I think about that and that theme in relation to artists like Langston Hughes, because as important and major a voice as he has, he does not represent all of Black thought for his time. And when I teach the Harlem Renaissance, for instance, we see the Langston Hughes type of theme where he wants African Americans to have a place at the table. And then there are more militant Black voices, typified by the likes of Marcus Garvey and others who have a different theme of resistance. And in Garvey's case, he propounded repatriation to Africa. And he does not have an accommodationist theme to his writings and his discourse the way Langston Hughes does. And I think it's important to try to incorporate as many voices as we can rather than just have a single voice stand in for, quote unquote, the Black experience. Langston Hughes was also consciously writing in the American tradition, and one of his forebears is Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman is a crucial figure in this discussion for his work, Leaves of Grass, which was done in several editions, as you know. First of all, in 1855, Walt Whitman has been called our premier poet of democracy. And that's because he incorporated into his free verse style a cataloging of American experience. And I'd like to ask my students in Lit 215, which is Introduction to Poetry. We just had a taste of Song of Myself, which is the opening poem in the first edition of Leaves of Grass, 1855. And I'd like to ask my students what types of Americans and what types of American experience he represents in Song of Myself. You can post that in the chat box. I'd like to hear from my Lit 215 students if I could. So that free verse, that cataloging of American experience, these are part of the democratic attributes of Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass incorporated the majority of Walt Whitman's intellectual life. And oddly, in a way, what he did was publish Leaves of Grass in 1855 and then expand and revise that book several times over the course of the rest of his life until the early 1890s, when we have the so-called deathbed edition. And there are at least 6 different editions of Leaves of Grass, depending on how you define an edition. And Whitman put as much of America as he could into each edition of Leaves of Grass. And he even incorporated quite a bit of the Civil War. And as we all were assigned in junior high school, you know, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," he recounted and memorialized Abraham Lincoln and wrote about the death of Lincoln in his work, along with many other things. Walt Whitman. I'd like to read you just a little bit from Song of Myself. "I speak the password primeval. I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have in their counterpart on the same terms. Through me, many long, dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations of prisoners and slaves, voices of the diseased and despairing, and of thieves and dwarfs, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion, and of the threads that connect the stars, and of wombs, and of the father stuff, and of the rights of them the others are down upon, of the deformed, trivial, flat, foolish, despised, fog in the air, beetles rolling balls of dung. Through me, forbidden voices, voices of sexes and lusts, voices veiled, and I remove the veil, voices indecent by me, clarified and transfigured." That's just a small piece of Song of Myself, but you can get the point, right? He is representing in his poetry people who don't at this time get much hype or any hype at all in poetry. Poetry of the 19th century in America and abroad generally incorporated a different type of experience, and you would not see the deformed, the trivial, the forbidden, the thieves, the dwarfs. He is incorporating everybody. That's our Uncle Walt. That is democratic in theory and practice. And the more you study this too, when you study the language of Walt Whitman, you find out that, you know, Walt Whitman loved language. He loved people. He loved the public scenes. You know, he's got a phrase about the blab of the pave, just the kind of chatter you hear in an urban landscape. And of course, the Walt Whitman that he was writing about in Leaves of Grass was an idealized version of himself. Still, that's remarkable that he has that degree of inclusion at a time when poetry was more for the elite and about other matters. A little bit about Walt Whitman. I'd like to turn to a different type of poetry. I'd like to turn to political poems. And my set piece for this part of the lecture is Carolyn Forche and her idea of the poetry of witness. This is also an element of kind of a democratic frame of mind, looking at that which is repressed. And Carolyn Forche, in a remarkable anthology titled Against Forgetting, came out in the early 1990s. It's an absolutely beautiful anthology about the 20th century poetry of witness. So this isn't just about America, but it has to do with poets writing in experiences of extremity and under political repression, facing genocide, the denial of human rights on a systematic level. It's an important anthology, and it's not just that I want to recommend a book that's nearly 30 years old, but it's really a type of viewing of experience that I think is important, because once you get habituated to understanding the poetry of witness, you begin to see it elsewhere. And that's why I've brought it in to today's discussion. So Nick, if you could please play Carolyn Forche and our segment on the poetry of witness.
Poets, when they're really writing poetry, are standing against injustice. They simply do that by virtue of recuperating from the human soul its natural prayer and consciousness. One of the things that's peculiar to me is when people say that they aren't political. Well, I agree with that statement. I agree that it's possible, but I don't know what it means. If we mean by that we don't take action in our lives, and that we don't oppose injustice and inhumanity, and that we don't stand against a government that is inflicting harm. If that is what being apolitical is, then I'm not apolitical. The accusation of being political is what led to my exploration of the poets of the 20th century who had endured conditions of extremity. And so I decided to restrict my study to poets who had endured conditions of extremity collectively inflicted through the depredations of the state, the failures of the state, or through warfare and so on. So I was interested in those who were incarcerated, those who endured military occupation, house arrest, forced exile, torture. And I found that outside the English-speaking world, most poets of the 20th century suffered some form of extremity. When I was making the presentation for the anthology's publication, the concept of a poetry of witness seemed difficult for the editors to whom I was making my appeal. So in order to help them, I told the story of one poet, and the poet I chose was Miklos Radnoti, who was the foremost Hungarian poet of his generation. In 1944, Miklos Radnoti was force-marched into the country that would become and once was Yugoslavia to do military forced labor. The Nazis, toward the end of the war, made peculiar decisions. Historians are still studying these decisions. Decisions to evacuate this camp and send all the prisoners to another camp. One of these decisions was to force march 2,000 of these slave laborers from Yugoslavia back into Hungary, among them the poet Miklos Radnoti, who chose to be with the first column. And before he left, he was able to obtain a small notebook. No one knows how. Force-marched in the snow with a unit of German soldiers back into Hungary with this notebook. They get across the Hungarian border and there are only 22 survivors of that march, among them Radnoti. The German soldiers wanted to get back to their units, and so they saw a hospital across the Hungarian border, and they tried to leave these 22 prisoners in that hospital, but the Hungarians barred the door. They were full, they were frightened, they didn't want anything to do with this. So the German soldiers took these 22 people to the forest and executed them. They buried them in a shallow grave, common grave. 2 years after the war, Miklos Radnotti's widow, Fanny Radnotti, went with the fellow villagers to this site in the forest, and they exhumed the bodies themselves and laid the bodies out on the field. And Fanny Radnotti went from corpse to corpse until she found her husband. He had been in the ground for 2 years. She went through the pockets of his clothing, pulled out the little notebook, peeled the pages apart, and dried them in the sun. And they held the last of his poems, the poems written on the forced march. And those were the poems I wanted to publish in Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness. So that volume begins with the Armenian genocide and it ends at Tiananmen Square, because Tiananmen Square was the last event before I published the book. And this volume begins with a quote from Bertolt Brecht: "In the dark times will there also be singing. Yes, there will be singing about the dark times." And then at the end, 145 poets later, writing from 30 languages, across time, across national borders, there's another Brecht quote, which is, "This then is all. It's not enough, I know. At least I'm still alive, as you can see. I'm like the man who took a brick to show how beautiful his house used once to be." There were very many quite astonishing things about this poetry when it's studied together, when it's collected and read as a whole body, rather than as separate works by poets living in different times and different literary cultures. It seemed to me that sometimes it was almost like a symphony of utterance, you know, a world voicing of what it meant to be a human being in the 20th century, and now in the 21st. Past 1 o'clock, you must have gone to bed. The Milky Way streams silver through the night. I'm in no hurry. With lightning telegrams, I have no cause to wake or trouble you. And as they say, the incident is closed. Love's boat has smashed against the daily grind. Now you and I are quits. Why bother then to balance mutual sorrows, pains, and hurts? Behold what quiet settles on the world. Night wraps the sky in tribute from the stars. In hours like these, one rises to address the ages, history, and all creation. Some people, that was his last poem. It was written just before he took his own life. Some people feel that it was written as a suicide note.
All right, that's Carolyn Forche. And she used that phrase, a symphony of utterances. And that speaks to the common chorus of humanity in these poems. And that is reminiscent of I Hear America Singing by Walt Whitman. Poetry of witness resonates with life in a world which denies human rights and or negates human life. It's a remarkable anthology, and it's, as I say, a way of seeing the world through poetry that I highly recommend. I'd like to move now to the discussion of diversity, inclusion, and quote unquote, the canon, CANON, which is a term that refers to that body of of books that belongs as the core. We speak of a biblical canon if we are Christian or Catholic. We speak of the literary canon at the university level. What gets assigned? Because life and the syllabus are short. And if you've got a semester of great American literature or great European literature or whatever the course may be, there is a selection process that has to occur. And every selection comes at the expense of others of its type. And so what does that mean ultimately for an education? And in the last generation, there's been a lively debate in particular, more than a generation actually, about what gets included, who gets included. Is it still going to be the old dead white males, or are we going to see more people of color, more international writers in our curriculum? And I think certainly the movement has been in the right direction to be more inclusive with the literature that we assign. I'd like to go right now to something that's kind of meant as comic relief, but also with a serious point underlaying it. And that's with this next clip in which Jiminy Glick interviews Ice Cube. If you're not familiar with Jiminy Glick, please know that that's a character portrayed by Martin Short. It is a bombastic interviewer type of character, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. But the reason I've chosen this particular clip is that Ice Cube, the rapper, challenges Jiminy Glick on who should be in the discussion. Let's see that clip.
You changed your name, though, from Vanilla Ice. How come?
Never changed my name. My name's always been Ice Cube since I was 12 years old.
What about O'Shea Jackson?
O'Shea is the name my mama gave me.
God, there's that wonderful Robbie Burns once said, the poet, "Oh, what a tangled web we weave, when first we practice to deceive."
Who?
Robbie Burns, a Scottish
Heard of.
poet.
A Scottish pimp?
Poet.
Oh, I thought you meant a Scottish pimp.
Poet, a
Okay,
Scottish
I'm
poet.
a poet too, a Scottish pimp, okay? L.A. pimp, Ice Cube.
And then you became a technician.
No, I became a rapper with the group NWA.
And that was successful?
Yep, and it meant niggas with attitudes.
Oh, my goodness gracious. The word attitude is a word we don't use anymore.
Yeah, but attitude is what people need. Some people need a little attitude in their life, you know, and it gets them going.
And you did a song called Straight Outta Compton.
Straight out of Compton.
That's
yeah.
wonderful. Where's Compton?
It's right here in Los Angeles, a little south of where we are, a lot south of where
Oh, no, I've never been
I
there.
know.
I've never been there.
Trust me, I know.
And I don't really plan to go there right soon.
I don't think you ever gonna go there.
No, I wouldn't. I love Rex Harrison. He was one of the first rappers, because he was, "Am I a woman, different than a girl?" And he did that in the wonderful My Fair Lady. I'd love to get your copy. And
Who?
Rex Harrison. You don't know who Rex Harrison is?
No.
Oh, my goodness. I'm sending you a series of books over on people that you should know about.
Do you know Big Sam?
Big Sam. I had
From my neighborhood. These are people you should know.
Big Sam.
Do you know T-Bone?
I've eaten a T-bone several times. I had one for lunch, smothered it in bacon. I loved it.
Well, you eat all, my friend. I got a friend named Hot Dog and a friend named Donut. Do you know any of them?
Why would I want to know any of them? They sound like mental people.
But these are people I know, people I grew up with. Why should I know the people that you want me to know, and you don't want to know the people that I know?
It's an interesting question you've laid on me, Vanilla. My instinct tells me that a lot of the people that you're referring to, I would pretend to like, but in the car ride home, privately, when I was doing notes to myself, I'd have to admit that I didn't like them. But I do think in reverse, if you met Robbie Burns or Rex Harrison, I think you'd say, "You know what? They're fun." All right.
There we go. If you've never seen Jiminy Glick, I recommend you do like I do and spend a few hours going through the videos. And that was an exchange that I like. And it boils down to the worlds that we occupy, the intellectual lives and worlds that we occupy. And Jiminy Glick in this bombastic persona says, you know, I don't know your world, and basically, I don't want to. Ice Cube replies, you know, do you know Big Sam? Do you know so-and-so? So the next, you know, rung in that discussion, to take that discussion to the next level, we would want Ice Cube to say, okay, tell us about Big Sam. Tell us about his artistry. Why should we know him? What is his message? And in that way, we can cross over into other neighborhoods, so to speak. And that's an interesting little exchange, because it shows the kind of isolation that can happen even within communities. The Jiminy Glick character says, I've never been there. It's just, you know, south of where they're speaking in that particular studio. And so I think education is definitely the great place to go to cross over into other communities and to meet new people. And that's one thing that I say to all of my poetry students every semester. Just be as open as you can. Think of yourselves as just playing the field in the field of literature, and you know, so to speak, date around. You know, maybe you'll have an impetuous fling with this poet, and maybe you'll start a new long-term relationship with that poet. It's important for us to have an exposure that is as diverse and as fortifying as possible. I'd like to go to my next subject, which is poetry's capacity to uncover submerged histories. Poetry expresses a life in a way that needs to be expressed through verse. There is something that requires that expression, at least in the mind of a poet, that this has to be a poem rather than a story or rather than another piece of art. And I'm fascinated perennially by how poetry can reveal uncovered histories, much like Carolyn Forche said a moment ago, with that remarkable story about the Hungarian poet Miklos Radnóti and his wife exhuming the body and recovering from oblivion her husband's final poems. I'd like to get into another type of submerged history, and I've got a couple of 3 clips to share with you. One of them is by Patricia Smith, and she is a Black American poet, and she has a poem in a different type of format. This is the spoken word format, and I wanted to bring in at least some spoken word because that has had a very democratizing effect on poetry since the 1980s. There's always been an oral dimension to poetry, but particularly since the mid-1980s with the work of poets and organizers like Mark Smith in Chicago, spoken word has become a national movement, and Patricia Smith is part of that. She gets into the psychology of skinheads. And this is an early 1990s clip, and I think it's just as relevant today as it was nearly 30 years ago. Let's listen to Skinhead by Patricia Smith.
From Chicago, Illinois, Patricia Smith.
They call me Skinhead, and I got my own beauty. It is knife scrawled across my back in sore, jagged letters. It is in the way my eyes snap away from the obvious. I sit in my dim matchbox on the edge of a bed, tousled with my ragged smell, slide razors across my hair, count how many ways I can bring blood closer to the surface of my skin. These are the duties of the righteous, the ways of the anointed. The face that moves in my mirror is huge and pockmarked, apple-cheeked, scraped pink and brilliant. I am filled with my own spit. 2 years ago, a machine that slices leather sucked in my hand and held it, whacking off 3 fingers at the root. I didn't feel nothing until I looked down and saw them on the floor next to my boot heel, and I ain't worked since then. I sit here and watch niggers take over my TV set, walking like kings up and down the sidewalks in my head. My shoulders tell me that ain't right, so I move out into the sun, where my beauty makes them lower their heads. I was born to make things right. It's easy now to bend my big body into shadows, to move from a place where there was nothing into the stark circle of a streetlight, the pipe raised up high over my head. It's a kick to watch their eyes get big, round and gleaming like cartoon jungle boys, just in that second before they know the pipe's gonna come down. And I got this thing I like to say, hey, listen to this. I like to say, hey, nigga! Abe Lincoln's been dead a long time. I get hard just listening to their skin burst. I was born to make things right. Then this reporter comes around. Seems I was a little sloppy kicking some fag's ass, and he opens up and screams about it. So this reporter finds me at home in bed. The TV flashes, licking my face clean. Same old shit. I ain't got no job. The coloreds and spics got 'em. Why ain't I working? Look at my hand, asshole. No, I'm not part of no organized group. I'm just a white boy who loves this race, fighting for a pure country. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes 3. Sometimes 30. AIDS will take care of the faggots. Then it's gonna be white on black in the streets. Then there'll be 3 million. I tell him that. So he writes it up, and I come off looking like I'm some kind of goddamn freak, like I'm Hitler himself. I ain't that lucky, but I got my own beauty. It's in my steel-toed boots, in the hard corners of my shaved head. I look in the mirror, and I hold up my mangled hand. Only the baby finger left. I know it's the wrong finger, but fuck you all anyway. I am riding the top rung of the perfect race, my face scraped pink and brilliant. I'm your baby, America. Your boy. Drunk on my own spit, I am goddamn fucking beautiful. And I was born and raised right here. Love you, girl.
All right. Finger. That's beautiful stuff from Patricia Smith. Let's go to another Black American poet, Tracy K Smith, recent poet laureate. And this is from her most recent volume titled Wade in the Water. And this uncovers something from letters, actual letters written to Abraham Lincoln by Civil War veterans. Let's hear Tracy K Smith.
This is an excerpt from a poem called I Will Tell You the Truth About This, I Will Tell You All About It. And it's a poem in which, in this section, soldiers in the Civil War and their families, all of whom are African American, are writing to President Lincoln with requests. Excellent Sir, my son went in the 54th Regiment. Sir, my husband, who is in Company K, 22nd Regiment, U.S. Colored Troops, and now in the Macon Hospital at Portsmouth with a wound in his arm, has not received any pay since last May, and then only $13. Sir, we, the members of Company D of the 55th Massachusetts Volunteers, call the attention of Your Excellency to our case. For instance, look and see that we never was freed yet, run right out of slavery into soldiery, and we hadn't nothing at all. And our wives and mother, most all of them, is a perishing all about, and we all are perishing ourself. I am willing to be a soldier and serve my time faithful like a man, but I think it is hard to be put off in such doggish manner as that. Will you see that the colored men fighting now are fairly treated? You ought to do this, and do it at once, not let the thing run along, meet it quickly and manfully. We poor oppressed ones appeal to you and ask fair play. So please, If you can do any good for us, do it in the name of God. Excuse my boldness, but please. Your reply will settle the matter and will be appreciated by a colored man who is willing to sacrifice his son in the cause of freedom and humanity. I have nothing more to say, hoping that you will lend a listening ear to an humble soldier. I will close. Yours, for Christ's sake. I shall have to send this without a stamp, for I hain't money enough to buy a stamp.
All right, we're back. Tracy K Smith, one of my favorite poets, and I recommend her to everybody. I'm checking out the comments section. I see people liking the Walt Whitman and the Langston Hughes and working class literature. I like to think of this as food. Literature really is food. And yeah, I like the little kind of popcorn and junk food pieces of literature, but I like the healthy, sustaining stuff. And one of the best anthologies that I've read in the last few years is this one, edited by Tracy K Smith, titled American Journal, 50 Poems for Our Time. And I'd like to read at least part of my last segment here. And if you could, Nick, give us the link to the website On Being. That might cut out our audio though. So I might just give you a taste of this poem by Layli Long Soldier, Native American poet from the Oglala Sioux Nation. And this is part of that whole phenomenon of poets uncovering submerged histories. And it's a very long poem. It takes her 15 to 20 minutes to read it in full when she does this at readings. I don't know that with time being what it is that I'll do that, but I'd like to give you a taste of this. And I'd like to ask my students in Lit 215 to read this in full. It's titled 38, Layli Long Soldier, and it has to do with the Dakota 38, an episode in history. Let me give you just a taste of this. Here, the sentence will be respected. I will compose each sentence with care by minding what the rules of writing dictate. For example, all sentences will begin with capital letters. Likewise, the history of the sentence will be honored by ending each one with appropriate punctuation, such as a period or question mark, thus bringing the idea to momentary completion. You may like to know I do not consider this a creative piece. I do not regard this as a poem of great imagination or a work of fiction. Also, historical events will not be dramatized for an interesting read. Therefore, I feel most responsible to the orderly sentence, conveyor of thought. That said, I will begin. You may or may not have heard about the Dakota 38. If this is the first time you've heard of it, you might wonder, what is the Dakota 38? The Dakota 38 refers to 38 Dakota men who were executed by hanging under orders from President Abraham Lincoln. To date, this is the largest legal mass execution in US history. The hanging took place on December 26th, 1862, the day after Christmas. This was the same week that President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In the preceding sentence, I italicize "same week" for emphasis. There was a movie titled Lincoln about the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. The signing of the Emancipation Proclamation was included in the film Lincoln. The hanging of the Dakota 38 was not. In any case, you might be asking, why were the 38 Dakota men hung? As a side note, the past tense of hang is hung, but when referring to the capital punishment of hanging, the correct past tense is hanged. So it's possible that you're asking, why were the Dakota 38 men hanged? They were hanged for the Sioux Uprising. I want to tell you about the Sioux Uprising, but I don't know where to begin. I may jump around, and details will not unfold in chronological order. Keep in mind, I am not a historian. I will recount facts as best as I can, given limited resources and understanding. And then she goes into pages of this episode and memorializes the hanging of the Dakota men in this uprising. And I'll give you one more taste. Now, every year, a group called the Dakota 38 plus 2 riders conduct a memorial horse ride from the lower Brule, South Dakota to Mankato, Minnesota. The memorial riders travel 325 miles on horseback for 18 days, sometimes through sub-zero blizzards. They conclude their journey on December 26th, the day of the hanging. Memorials help focus our memory on particular people or events. Often memorials come in the forms of plaques, statues, or gravestones. The memorial for the Dakota 38 is not an object inscribed with words, but an act. And it's that act that I find part of the beauty of this very important poem. And it's that act of reading poetry and engaging in it, writing it ourselves even, that's part of the democratic experiment. Now I'm going to take a look at the comments box to see if we've got any questions or comments, because it's 50 minutes after the hour and I'd like to know what people have to say. And it looks like comments about poetry and about some of the pieces that I've shared rather than particular questions. If you've got questions, pop in with those right now. Otherwise, we're about to conclude. And I'll conclude with one of my points of departure, which was Joseph Brodsky. And I'm intrigued by the fact that he was imprisoned for simply writing poetry, that the kind of free act that poets engage in was verboten by the state. And he was put on trial. He was convicted of being a social parasite. That was the language that the court used back in the 60s in the Soviet Union, that a poet was a social parasite. Years later, he would be honored for his work in poetry with the Nobel Prize for Literature and also with the appointment as poet laureate. Joseph Brodsky, in an essay titled Less Than One, says that he and his cohorts were avaricious readers of literature because the world that was in those books was more real to Joseph Brodsky and people like him than the world that they immediately occupied. Books, perhaps because of their formal element of finality, held us in their absolute power. Dickens was more real than Stalin or Beria. More than anything else, novels would affect our modes of behavior and conversations, and 90% of our conversations were about novels. A relationship could have been broken for good over a preference for Hemingway over Faulkner. The hierarchy in that pantheon was our real Central Committee, an allusion to the Central Committee of the Soviet Union. It started as an ordinary accumulation of knowledge, but soon became our most important occupation, to which everything could be sacrificed. Books became the first and only reality, whereas reality itself was regarded as either nonsense or nuisance. Compared to others, we were ostensibly flunking or faking our lives, but come to think of it, existence which ignores the standards professed in literature is inferior and unworthy of effort. That quotation is on page 2 of the handout at the top of this webpage. So if you haven't gotten that, please click that and take that home with you. That's what I've got this morning. That's an hour of power on poetry. I want to thank you for joining me. I would like to encourage you to stay tuned at 11:30 p.m. We have a panel that's going to be awesome, I'm sure. It's on civic engagement in wake of the pandemic. And then at 1 p.m., a panel discussion on Black Lives Matter. Thank you, good morning, and have a great day.